David was thrilled when the mighty Mick first paid attention to him. The Stones were from his own middle-class suburban South London, and they'd been by far the most successful local heroes on the scene. They were the very top big boys, up to their necks in sex and drugs and money, while the little boys, David and his friends, were still drawing allowance from their dads. Some of the seminal adventures of David's adolescence, as he told me when we traded our life stories, were played out to a soundtrack of Rolling Stones music. David and Mick became very fast friends very quickly, and it was rather amusing for the rest of us. They were always yakking on the phone together like teenagers, or going to see each other at the studio, or inviting each other over to hear their mixes. I wasn't much involved. I'd been to Mick and Bianca's house and tried to be friendly with Bianca, but she was very reserved, and nothing I did seemed to break the ice. I think she was uncomfortable because of my friendship with Marianne Faithfull. Oh well, I've endured worse disappointments. My appearances at the Jaggers were infrequent, therefore. I remember only 2 visits with any clarity. One was when I was on some sort of business for David, and Mick was working with Mick Taylor on the song that would become Angie, and the other for Mick's birthday party. There was a lot of that sort of thing in our circle, and indeed in London in general, partly because the city is so spread out and difficult to negotiate in the middle of the night, and partly because the English have long been accustomed to intimately shared living quarters. Our friends thought nothing of staying over at our house after a party, or whatever, or of our crashing at their places. It was no big deal. You found somewhere to sleep and claimed it, not worrying much about other bodies scattered here and there. But to some people, I suppose it seemed odd. Middle-class American visitors, representatives of the only society on earth rich enough to have grown accustomed to living one to a room, often tend to be shocked, thinking such arrangements unsanitary and probably even immoral. Perhaps that's why such a furor of publicity erupted when, as a guest on Joan Rivers' talk show, I mentioned that one morning I came upon David and Mick sharing a bed. I had just flown back to London from New York. I entered the house on Oakley Street, went into the kitchen, and Daniela told me, "I think Mick and David are asleep upstairs." I said, "Oh, okay." Went up, opened the bedroom door, and they were, indeed, asleep in our bed. I asked them if they wanted coffee, and they said yes, and that was that. There are 2 ways of looking at that incident. One was that it was just a thoroughly normal London scene. Best friends stagger home drunk or stoned from some night spot or party or whatever, strip off their clothes somehow and fall into bed and pass out. Morning comes, wife arrives with wake-up beverage, hangover begins, life resumes. But oh no, Joan Rivers and her studio and television audience, and every gossip columnist in the world, leapt straight to the other obvious conclusion, which is that since Mick Jagger had been found in bed with David Bowie, Mick must be, gasp, gay, or, even worse, faint, bisexual. Well, leaving aside the question of why on earth that should have been news to anyone who'd paid any attention to the Stones' affairs, particularly the convoluted girlfriend swapping and buddy bonding among Mick, Keith, and Brian before Brian ended up in that swimming pool, I really don't like the automatic assumption that if 2 men are found in bed together, something sexual must be happening. It's so square, so typically American. On the other hand, however, I think the assumption was correct. Or to put it another way, when I walked into that room and found Mick and David together, I felt absolutely dead certain that they'd been screwing. It was so obvious, in fact, that I had never even considered the possibility that they hadn't been screwing. The way they'd been running around together and the way David made a virtual religion of slipping the lance of love into almost everyone around him, and then the fact that Mick had a perfectly good bed of his own just 300 yards away from where he was passed out naked with David. It all added up inescapably in my mind as well as my gut. I didn't have to look around for open jars of KY. Maybe I should have, because then my eyes would have seen the proof of what I knew in my heart. But I didn't. So I can't say conclusively that those 2 alley cats were actually going at it that night. While they were still awake together in my bed, I wasn't there.